Next on TCM, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, then The Thing from Another World, and later, Grey Gardens. TCM's got a green thumb tonight.
Well, Felicia, it's been such a pleasure to have you on TCM tonight and talk about your book, The Goth Garden. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So how did you become interested in gardening and in particular goth gardens?
Well, it did start when I was a garden editor and I just did a deep dive into gardening. I became a master gardener.
Wow.
And really, I'd always planted things, but went pretty hard for more southern plants because I live in Atlanta. So a lot of classic hydrangeas and gardenias and tea olives and things like that. But as I've gotten much more into goth gardens, I'm starting to try to plant more dark-hued things. I have a preference for perennials because they're so much easier to maintain than annuals, but one of my favorite annuals is castor bean, which I grow every year in my garden because it's so strange. It is an absolutely extraterrestrial-looking plant that could have done very well in Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yeah, we're about to see the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Philip Kaufman and starring Donald Sutherland. This is a different take on the story compared to the 1956 original, isn't it?
What makes it so different is the two stars, Brooke Adams and Donald Sutherland. To me, they have a kind of countercultural element. You know, he is shown in one scene cooking some Asian food in a wok. And Brooke Adams has her own greenhouse in her apartment. I think they're both a little out of step with the culture at large, and that's expressed in the storyline of these people who've been taken over by pods, who've been birthed from pods to become sort of Stepford wife figures. It's a statement about the time, 1978, and people who wanted to take a different path, and the pod people oppressing the artists and the iconoclasts in society. So I think it has a little bit different spin in that time period.
Yeah, and even though it does speak to the 70s, we can also relate it to the Victorian era because this was a time when there was a real fear and fascination around plants. With the characters here, they're really fascinated by these new kind of flowers with the pods. They don't know what they are.
Right.
But they also are quite dangerous, and that's what we see in a lot of Gothic literature from the time.
Absolutely. There was a whole actual subgenre in the Victorian age of short stories that were about killer plants. H.G. Wells wrote a story called The Flowering of the Strange Orchid, which is about an orchid that's imported from South America and is grown in a greenhouse. It eventually gets its hands on its owner and drains him of blood. So there was, on one hand, this Victorian worship of exotic species, of ferns and orchids, and so much fascination with these exotic specimens, but at the same time, a great deal of fear. What are these things we're embracing and bringing into our homes and greenhouses that came from places very far away?
And here the plant spores come from very far away.
Right.
What should we look out for? What are the scenes you think we should watch in this film?
Well, the opening scene is fantastic. Apparently, it was done on a very low budget. I think it was $3.5 million, and it ended up making about $24 million. So there was a lot of plexiglass and plywood and cut-rate art supplies used to create this incredible scene where these life forms are on a distant planet and start sending out spores that travel through space and eventually land in San Francisco. And it's also something that we see a lot in the natural world is the tenacious, tentacled, exploratory nature of plants. Anyone who's ever had any run-in with bamboo or poison ivy or ivy itself can relate to the nature of these spores that suddenly start to sprout their own tendrils on these plant leaves and eventually grow into what I think looks like okra, these slimy pods that people have also said are very close to a milkweed pod in terms of the look of these engorged things that sprout people instead of seeds.
It sounds ridiculous, but it is a really creepy film. So Felicia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And let's get to the film, also with Jeff Goldblum and Leonard Nimoy. This is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Oh, Felicia, such a creepy ending with Donald Sutherland doing his big.
Oh,
Ugh.
I hope it doesn't happen here.
I was really hoping Nancy would survive because that's Veronica Cartwright, who was little Kathy in The Birds. I was like, come on, Kathy,
You
you
got to
can
make it.
survive. It's also fun to see the cameos from Kevin McCarthy, who starred in the original Invasion of the
Absolutely.
Body Snatchers, and director Don Siegel, who played the taxi driver.
Of course, there's a cameo from Robert Duvall dressed as a priest swinging. It was apparently a role he did for free. He's also meant to be the first pod person, so a little hint of things to come.
Oh, that makes sense because he's kind of encouraging them to get the flowers.
And hanging around the flowers a little bit too much.
Yeah. Well, your book, The Goth Garden, explores the history of all these plants that we now think of as Gothic plants. And that's what I find so fascinating about your book is that I've read several gardening books, and usually they are quite dry. But here you really lean into that, the references to art and literature and the history. What did you learn by writing this book?
I learned that things that we consider so ubiquitous and commonplace can be so rich with meaning. I think often about rosemary, which so many of us grow in our gardens. It seems like a fairly benign plant,
Yeah.
but it has a long history and association with death and remembrance. It was used in embalming practices in ancient Egypt during the plague. Those strange plague doctors who wore the mask with the kind of bird-like beak would sometimes put rosemary and lavender and other fragrant herbs into the beak. It was believed in the miasma theory that by smelling something pleasant, you would be less susceptible to the plague.
Mm.
So it's had sort of a history of being used in funerals, made into wreaths, tossed into graves. And it seems like an innocent enough thing to grow in your garden, but once you know that, you look at it a little bit differently.
Yeah. And the Victorian era was also a time when there was a real sense of a battle between science and nature. Is that correct?
Absolutely. There was so much invention at the time. There was, Louis Pasteur germ theory, things like the bicycle and the telephone were being invented. So a great deal of innovation, but with innovation, I think, comes radical change and fear of what that change will yield. And so many Gothic novels of the time kind of treat that fear, I think, especially of Frankenstein, where it's a horrific concept of science really out of control. So yes, while there was a reverence and celebration of nature, Victorians were obsessed with so many things. They loved ferns, they loved celery. They were going deep into everything botanical and often in a very scientific manner, really studying and collecting things, but also frightened at what science, the road it could lead us down.
I mean, your book is wonderful, and we should make mention of the illustrations inside your book because alongside the 50 plants that you talk about are illustrations of them, which look like botanical paintings of the time.
They are so beautifully done. They are done by an illustrator who's Russian. Her name is Irina Vinik, and she actually lives in Serbia now. But I would say she's 50% of the book. My writing is one half, but really her illustrations set such a tone, really capture the mood of what I'm talking about in a beautiful way. So I'm so grateful that the publisher found her to illustrate the plants because she does a wonderful job.
Well, Felicia, it's been so fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for being on TCM tonight.
Oh, I so appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. But stay watching TCM now because, as always, we have more classic films uncut and commercial free.
Next on TCM, The Thing from Another World, then Grey Gardens, and later, The Trouble with Girls. TCM is part of the problem tonight.